106 years ago today, on the 1st of September 1914, an old lady breathed her last and passed away in Cincinnati, USA. She was entirely alone. There were no friends and family around her at the time of her death. She was a widow, her husband George having passed away 4 years earlier. She was the last of her line, with no surviving children or relatives. Her name was Martha, and she was the very last passenger pigeon on Earth. My name's Jem, and I'm the Crazy Pigeon Lady, and it's my mission to entertain, educate and inspire people with all things pigeon and dove. And in this month's Pigeocation Monthly, recorded today on the 1st of September, Martha Day, I'm here to talk about the passenger pigeon. The passenger pigeon was a species of pigeon known by the Latin name Ectopistes migratorius, which means migratory wanderer, and in English the passenger pigeon, a corruption of the French word passager, meaning to pass by, which they did in huge numbers. It was an eastern North American species, occupying most of the eastern half of the United States, all the way up into southeastern parts of Canada and even as far south as Florida, breeding around the area of the Great Lakes. And by 1914, at the time of Martha's death, their species had become entirely extinct. It was a notable extinction because, unlike other extinctions, particularly those involving birds, the passenger pigeon was very, very numerous and was a continental bird. Typical bird extinctions previous to that, perhaps most memorably that of the dodo, had been on small populations of birds residing on islands with very small, vulnerable ecosystems that were hugely affected by outside influences brought by humans, including introduced predators like rats or cats, or the destruction of their habitat. But this was not so the case of the passenger pigeon. This was a bird that was incredibly common, and it was numerous, and it was widespread, and was occupied a huge continent. So here's their story and how they became extinct, and how Martha ended up being the very last of her kind. I want you to imagine for the moment what it might be like to be surrounded by billions of birds. And passenger pigeons at the height of their species did number in the billions. And in the modern world, where we're not used to seeing these huge animal spectacles, it's difficult to imagine what billions and billions of individual animals might look like. So let me try to put that in the picture for you. To give you a sense of the scale of the number of birds, in the UK today, the RSPB, the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, estimate that our most common wild pigeon, the European wood pigeon, Columba palumbus, numbers around 550,000 pairs, so around 1.1 million birds. And if you live in the UK, or indeed large parts of Europe, you'll be very familiar with this bird, and it's a common visitor to parks and gardens. But the passenger pigeon numbered in the billions. It was possibly the most numerous bird that lived, and therefore when you saw a passenger pigeon flock, you were seeing birds that would number many thousands of times the entire population of wild wood pigeons in Britain today. So what might that experience be like? Well, we know quite a lot about passenger pigeons flocks and how they appeared, because there are lots of contemporary accounts from the time that describe them. And although they come from different people and taken at different times, there's a lot of consistency there in terms of what it was like to encounter passenger pigeons. Most accounts describe the flocks of birds being so numerous and so dense that they darkened the skies as if there were an eclipse. And the sound of them approaching from many miles away, of those billions and billions of beating wings, sounding like the approach of rolling thunder that would terrify dogs and horses, and even was considered portentous of some form of doom that was about to befall people. It is said that when the birds flew past, they flew past in such numbers that it would take many, many hours or even days for an entire flock to pass from start to finish. And there is one account of the time of a gentleman who was riding on a long journey from one state to the other, and he actually charts the passing of the flocks. And it's many, many hours of continuous passing by, and the flock didn't seem to diminish in number. It's also said that when the dung fell, it fell like rain, and when the birds rested in trees, it would heap in piles at least 2 feet deep on the forest floor. And it was said that after they had nested or fed on the trees, sometimes piled many birds high on branches when they roosted, that the forest was completely destroyed as if a tornado had passed through. So let's talk a little bit about the species of the passenger pigeon, now that we've got some idea of the massive, majestic scale of this bird and quite the impact and impression that they would have made on those people that saw them at the time that they lived. It was a medium-sized pigeon, although of quite a slender form with a long pointed tail. They were sexually dimorphic. That means that the male and female were different in appearance. So the males were a slaty blue-grey colour and had a kind of bronzy coloured chest, and were said to be very attractive to look at. The females were duller in colour and much more brown and had dark markings on them, and the juveniles were also similar. They were incredibly fast flying birds. They flew at around 60 miles an hour, and it was said that the passing of a passenger pigeon passed at the speed of a thought, and their speed also earned them the nickname the Blue Meteor for the flash of blue of the male birds flying by. Their main foods was tree mast, that is to say tree nuts, particularly beech nuts, acorns and chestnuts, although at the right times of year they would also take grain, particularly from farmers' fields and commercial crops, but they would also eat fruits as well. In order to access these sources of food, which were seasonal, and in order to support the vast numbers of birds that existed in the flock, it was necessary for them to be both migratory and nomadic as well. No one patch of forest would have been able to have sustained that many birds for such a long amount of time, and therefore they had to move around all of the time, exploiting these food sources at the times when those seeds or fruits or grains were abundant. And so they ranged over an absolutely huge area and would travel quite great distances from their roost or their nesting sites in order to find food. They nested communally in vast areas. Nesting could take up hundreds of square miles of primary forest, and it was said that they were like bird cities, and that the sound was incredibly loud of all of these birds. They laid one egg. The birds weren't very well studied in their time, so there's some dispute about some of these details, but it's generally thought that they laid one egg. And everything about their breeding cycle was geared up to speed and efficiency. So it's thought that their incubation period was only about 15 days. So to compare that to, for example, the feral or domestic pigeon, the rock dove columbolivia, their incubation is about 18 days. But also they not only did they hatch quite quickly, they also fledged quite quickly too. It was also thought that they took about another 15 days in order to reach fledging age. And again, to compare that to the rock dove will fledge in 25 to 30 days, so getting on for twice as long. So they were all geared up to speed, because of course the flock sizes were so vast that they couldn't sustain all of these birds for any particular length of time, and therefore they had to breed quickly and get their babies to fledging age quickly so that they could move on and exploit other sources of food. They have a very interesting fledging strategy, which is that once the baby pigeons reached the age where they were ready to leave the nest, the parents didn't actually assist them or support them in any way. In fact, the parents would abandon the babies completely and leave them in the nest. And it was therefore left for the baby birds to make the way out of the nest on their own. And they would fall to the ground, and it was said that they would crawl along, not being able to fly very well, and that thousands of these babies would just take up space in fields and forest, gradually eating food as they go, gradually growing and gradually building up strength in their wings until eventually they could take off. And of course, predators and indeed humans would take advantage of this mass fledging of these birds in order to pick up an easy source of prey. However, there were so many of them that generally predators didn't make a huge dent in their numbers. So let's talk now about their path to extinction. The passenger pigeon was historically hunted for thousands of years by Native Americans. However, it is believed that their population didn't really change significantly or was hugely impacted for around 20,000 years before the decline of the bird really started in the 19th century. The Native American Seneca people believed that the passenger pigeons were led by a pure white bird who was the chief of the passenger pigeons, and had attended a council of birds where it had been agreed that the passenger pigeons would be the ones to offer their bodies in tribute to humans because they were so numerous and nested in colonies, and therefore they were very much respected as a food source and were hunted in a sustainable way. White Europeans arrived in the United States around the 16th century, and there are early accounts of the passenger pigeon where they were variously described as wild pigeons or wood pigeons or turtle doves, where they would have been likening these birds to birds that they were familiar with back on the European continent. But it wasn't really until the 19th century, with the massive expansion of the population in the United States and huge amounts of development and settlements gradually moving west, that the true decline in the passenger pigeon species really began. And even then, it was only really from 1870 onwards that that decline was starting to precipitate at speed, and it took just around 20 to 25 years from 1870 onwards for the birds to go from being incredibly numerous to extinct in the wild. In 1878, in Petoskey, Michigan, was recorded the last great nesting. Although sadly at that time they were still being shot in huge numbers. It was said that around 50,000 birds a day were killed during that nesting in 1878. Despite the very emotive and controversial effect of hunting on the birds, it's actually not considered to be the primary cause of their extinction, although it almost certainly did exacerbate the decline of the species. The primary cause of the passenger pigeon is probably most likely to be habitat loss. So when you think about it, these vast flocks needed vast forests, and vast forests are very productive trees producing the food that they needed to survive on. However, at that time, during the massive increase in population of human settlements, forests were being cut down to provide wood for the building of buildings or for fuel or for the building of the railways. And therefore this was destroying the passenger pigeon's source of food, which meant that they couldn't sustain the sizable populations. The reduction in their food therefore meant a reduction in their flocks and sizes in their breeding success, and the pressure of large-scale commercial hunting would have exacerbated the reduction in their numbers even further. Both habitat loss and commercial hunting were exacerbated by the fact that there were almost no protections for passenger pigeons that existed at the time. Conservation was a very new concept. People didn't believe that the birds needed any protection because there evidence of their own eyes, it seemed to indicate it that the birds were almost infinite in number, and therefore nobody ever truly believed that they could disappear entirely. However, sadly disappear that they did. And by the late 1890s, they were incredibly rare, and there are very few authenticated sightings. The last nest and egg was collected in around 1895, and the last fully authenticated case of a wild bird, unfortunately shot, is from 1901. After that point, the passenger pigeons simply existed only in captivity. So let's come full circle back to Martha, who I spoke about right at the beginning of this video. Martha was the last passenger pigeon. She lived at the Cincinnati Zoo. And the Cincinnati Zoo had kept passenger pigeons since they'd opened in 1875. Not because at that time of their opening that they were considered especially rare, but because they were a significant native species who many people didn't necessarily get to see up close, and therefore they were kept for that reason. Martha herself is suspected to have been a bird that was donated by Charles Otis Whitman, who was amongst a small number of people who also kept and attempted to breed passenger pigeons in captivity. By 1909, Martha and 2 males were the only residents left at the Cincinnati Zoo, believed to be the only passenger pigeons left in the world. The male died in 1909, and Martha's mate, George, died a year later in 1910. And for the 4 years that followed that, Martha attracted celebrity status for sadly being the last passenger pigeon on Earth. She was a bit of a spectacle. Many people would come to the zoo to visit her, and because she was old and a little decrepit, some people would even throw sand or little stones at her to try and get her to move inside the cage, and eventually they had to rope the area off to stop people doing that. When she died, it was thought she died around the age of 29, which is very old indeed for what once was a wild bird. And once she died, her body was quickly preserved in ice, and she was shipped by train to the Smithsonian Museum, where she still resides today in a taxidermied display in the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History. Thank you for listening. I hope that's been of interest to learn about Martha, the last passenger pigeon, and the story of the extinction. It's a very important story that we mustn't forget, because it's one of the most notable and egregious forms of extinction that has been precipitated by man in recent times, and therefore there are a lot of lessons that we need to learn as a species, and I hope that the story of Martha and the passenger pigeon is something that will inform conservation efforts for many years to come, to remind us that no matter how numerous an animal, that it is still possible for it to be destroyed at the hand of man, and therefore we have it within our gift in order to be able to avoid that. Thanks very much for watching. Please like and share. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel. Hit that notification bell so that you can be the first to be notified about new videos that are posted. Thanks very much for watching, and goodbye.